Hey, it's Mary Kay from Reinventing Mama Way, and today we are talking about needles that we use in our sewing machines. Be that our sewing machine, our serger, our cover stitch. That's the type of thing we're talking about. I ain't talking about hand sewing. I want to give a special shout out to our friends at Mama Can Do It, as they will also be using this video on their site as well. So, like I said, this is going to be a beginner's series, or a beginner video, I should say. And you do need to do one thing before you leave your house. You need to know what type of needle system your machine uses, and you can find that information in your manual. The most common machine system is the 130-705H. You can see that here at the bottom of this case of needles. And you'll see that available at just about any craft store that you go into. The next thing you need to know is what type of fabric are you going to be sewing on. You will match the type of needle. Like here we have a stretch needle, or universal, which is somewhat universal, but not really. I also have jersey and microtex. I also have jeans and leather needles in my arsenal. You may also need some quilting needles if you're quilting, but specialty needles, like if you're making a special stitch, like a wingtip needle for, I think it's called a handkerchief stitch, like you would find in heirloom sewing. But basically, if you have a type of fabric or thread that is something special, like it's thicker, like denim, you would need to use a denim needle. Or if you have a metallic thread, you would want to use a metallic needle. Embroidery thread, you'd want to use an embroidery needle. A universal needle, you can see that I have this nice big pack right here. But a universal needle, you can use it in most fabrics except for very thick or very fine. One exception is a knit fabric. If you have a printed fabric that has a base that is a different color, such as a lot of the custom knits are printed on a white base, the universal needle will sometimes tend to distort the stitch, and the color of the base will show through. I've also had that happen on double brush poly, so your customs, your double brush poly that are printed. Basically anything that's printed, I would not use a universal needle on. Supposedly it does have a ballpoint tip instead of a pointier tip, but it's not universal. So, turn my computer back on. So, woven fabrics, you know, your quilting cottons, you're making a little girl's dress, universal is fine. If you're making something that's maybe out of a lawn cotton, you might want to go to a microtex needle, something that has a more open weave to it. You would want to use a different needle. You would want to use a microtex there, just so it doesn't break the fine threads. And then if you're sewing with knits, you do need to use a ballpoint needle. There are two types of ballpoint needles. Some brands do not differentiate, but my favorite brand, Schmidt's, does. And the two types of ballpoint needles are jersey and stretch. Jersey is for a lower spandex content. Stretch is for a higher spandex content. This would be something like an interlock or a double brush poly that has 4% spandex, or lycra. Spandex is the general, generic term. Stretch needle would be something like a supplex that has a higher stretch, a higher spandex content. I typically use a stretch in anything that has spandex successfully. That way I don't have to change my needle as much. But there is a difference. The jersey is the lower spandex to no spandex content. And then this would be low to high spandex content. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about, because basically you're going to be buying universal needles, a couple of specialty needles, and you're going to be buying ballpoint needles for your knits. The next thing that we need to talk about is the size of the needle. And I was misinformed when I first started sewing, and therefore have probably misinformed many people about the size needle you should be using. You can see on this pack, the jersey, that there are several different sizes here at the bottom. And I thought that had to do with the openness or the thickness of your fabric. It does not. It has to do with the size thread that you're using. And so you think, okay, what size thread am I using? Well, there are a couple of different ways that you can measure your thread. You can measure it by weight or by length. But a rule of thumb is that big selection in your craft store that you're probably buying your thread out of, that is a size 75/11. See that sizing at the bottom down there? Now, if your thread is bulkier, like you're using a top stitching thread, you would need a bigger size needle, like 9014. And if your thread is finer than that, you would need a smaller size needle, like with the Microtex, 7010. The only other thing we really need to cover is a twin needle. And this gives you those double lines that look a little bit like a cover stitch from the front, but it's a zigzag on the back. It doesn't have the numerous threads on the back of it like a cover stitch does. It's just one bobbin thread, and you use this in your sewing machine. Don't put it in your serger. But you need to be sure that the type of twin needle you buy corresponds to the type of fabric that you're sewing. Like I said before, the universal needles do not work well in double brush poly and custom fabrics that have a different color base, the ones that are printed. You need to be sure that you have stretch twin needles for those. And then this is one little tip that I do. I'm not sure if this is going to be pointing to the right or the left, but I draw an arrow on my twin needles so that I remember to move my needle position over so that I don't break my needle by hitting the side of my foot. But I put those little arrows on my twin needles the first time I use them. So the only other thing I wanted to go over is when do you need to change your needle? Well, you need to change your needle after about 6 to 8 hours of use. Some people change it at the beginning of every project, but 6 to 8 hours of use is a good rule. That's the recommendation that I've seen most often. If you have shredded or broken threads, I made a list, so I want to make sure I get all of them. Shredded or broken threads, skipped or distorted stitches that might be quite a little bit of a different length, they're uneven, puckered or damaged fabrics, and popping sounds when you're sewing. And I got those straight off of the Schmetz needle site. They have an arsenal of information on there, and the geek in me wanted to provide you with every detail, but I did I did restrain myself. So if you have any questions, let me know. I hope that that has been thorough enough to get you to the store, get your needles selected, get you out of the store and home at your sewing machine. Happy sewing.